The Fuji X-T4 builds on a very solid foundation which was the Fuji X-T3, and it brings a few new features to the table. One of the features that I'm quite interested in is the in-body image stabilisation. I spend most of my time with a camera out shooting landscapes, so my camera is on the tripod a lot. But if the in-body image stabilisation works well for me, I can certainly see myself taking a lot more shots handheld. So because of this, I've done some testing. I really wanted to see how useful the IBIS would be for me. And I've done a number of tests which I want to talk about in this video. I'll cover briefly the tests that I've done and explain how I've tested the IBIS. I'll show you the results and then we'll summarise at the end what I've learned from this and how I can put it into effect when I'm out on location. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that my testing is not scientific by any means. It can of course vary based on your own technique and how effective you are at hand holding the camera steadily, and it can also vary on the lens that you're using. So for this test, I've designed it in a manner that's going to give me the knowledge I need in terms of how effective IBIS will be for me. I've run this test based on having the X-T4 for a couple of days, and I've not really put any extra effort into how I hand hold the camera in a desperate attempt to get really steady, sharp images. That's not been the case at all, so it's very much a real world test, and I hope you can gain some information from it as well. So for the test, I've used two lenses. I've used the Fuji XF 16-55mm lens. That lens doesn't have any stabilization built in. So I've run some tests with that lens with IBIS off and then with IBIS on. And then the second lens that I've used is the Fuji XF 50-140, this one here. And this lens does have stabilization. So again, I've run the tests with IBIS and lens stabilization off and then with it on. So we'll have a look at those results and see what we can learn from them. Now, when I'm shooting handheld shots, I base my shutter speed that I need to use based on the reciprocal rule. So in simple terms, if I was shooting on a full frame camera at say 50mm, my shutter speed would be 1/50th of a second or faster to ensure that I get nice sharp shots free of any hand movement or camera shake. But I'm shooting these tests obviously on the X-T4. It's a crop sensor camera, so I'm multiplying my focal length by 1.5, and that's the slowest shutter speed I would consider using to try and get sharp images. I also want to point out that in terms of shutter speed, I was using full stops only to conduct this test. I should also point out that I set my camera to the mechanical shutter, and I was also in continuous shooting mode. And what I did at each shutter speed was take 2 sets of 3 images. And the reason I did this was just to give me 6 images at each shutter speed, so I had enough data to look at to get a fair test. And also my hope was that for the second shot in each burst, it would not be affected by my finger movement on the shutter, which could potentially move the camera a little bit. So that was my reason for taking 2 sets of 3 bursts. Also, I'm really not concerned about image quality in terms of any issues with using a high ISO. And when you actually see the images, they'll be, as I saw them in Lightroom, just imported as raw files with no sharpening applied to them whatsoever. So we're really looking at the raw data here. But anyway, let's move on and take a look at the images. So as we have a look through these images, please remember that I was working only in full stops in terms of my shutter speed. So the first set were taken with the Fuji XF 16-55mm lens and with IBIS turned off. And I decided to shoot at 33mm, which is roughly the middle of the focal length range for this lens. So in terms of shutter speed, I would have been using 1/50th of a second or faster to ensure I get a sharp image. However, because I'm working in full stops, I shot at 1/60th of a second, and as you'd expect, this image is perfectly sharp. The next image here was taken at 1/30th of a second, and out of the 6 that I took, only a few were sharp, so I'm not guaranteed to get excellent results if I'm only taking one shot at this shutter speed. Moving on to the next shutter speed, which was 1/15th of a second, and my results show that I'm not guaranteed a sharp image at this shutter speed. In fact, my best one, which I'm showing now, is not sufficiently sharp in my opinion. I also tried a few shots at 1/8th of a second and the results were not good at all, but I did get one which was almost sharp, but it's not a shutter speed I would consider using at this focal length. Moving on to the next set of images, and these were all captured with IBIS turned on at the same focal length as before. I've started at 1/15th of a second because all 6 images were sharp when taken at this shutter speed. Moving on to 1/8th of a second, I got quite a high percentage sharp, but not all of them. So if I was using this shutter speed, I wouldn't be confident of getting the image sharp if I only took one frame. Then as we move on to 1/4 of a second, I was still able to get a sharp image, but it was a very low percentage out of the 6 that I took. So I definitely need to pay some attention to this and take multiple frames if I was considering using that shutter speed. And then I'm going to show you, just for information here, this is a 1/2 second exposure and it is pretty sharp, but you need to work quite hard to get this, or at least I did. And I'm also going to show, just for reference, we've got a 1 second exposure and it's not sharp enough in my opinion. It's not completely sharp, but considering it's a 1 second exposure handheld, it is quite a good result. But you would need to shoot quite a lot of these, or at least I would, based on my experience, in order to get a sharp image. Let's move on to the next set of images. These were all captured with the XF50 to 140 lens, and for the first set of 3 that we're going to look at, IBIS was turned off. So I shot these at 50mm, and this image was shot at 1/125th of a second. It's using high ISO, hence the image quality, but the image is very sharp, so no problems there. Then I moved on to 1/60th of a second. Now I'm not going to get all 6 of my images sharp using this shutter speed, but I did get a few of them. So if it's a situation where I can take a few images, it's quite possible I'll get a sharp one taken at 1/60th of a second. And finally, just for reference, I'm going to show this one taken handheld at 1/30th of a second. Not something that I'd recommend with this big heavy lens at this focal length, but it just goes to show if you take enough images you can sometimes get a sharp one, but it's not something I'd really consider if I was trying to take a photo of something that's important to me. So the next set of images that we're going to take a look at here were taken with the same lens at the same focal length, but I switched on the lens stabilisation, and then when you go into the menu on the X-T4, it shows that it is switched on and there's no way you can change that in the menu. So looking at the first one here, taken at 1/125th of a second, as you'd expect, it's perfectly sharp. Moving on to 1/60th of a second, again perfectly sharp as well. Remember, I'm ignoring any effects of ISO in these tests. Then at 1/30th of a second, again the image was perfectly sharp, and I could get all my images sharp out of the burst there, so I'm quite confident at this shutter speed I'll get the image sharp in my first attempt. Moving on, we're at 1/15th of a second, and again at this shutter speed I'm very confident I can get a sharp image in one shot. Moving on to 1/8th of a second, I now found it a bit harder to get a sharp image, so there was no guarantee I would get a sharp shot if I only took one frame. I'd certainly need to take a few at this shutter speed. Moving on to 1/4 of a second, I found it was quite hard to get a sharp image at that shutter speed, so you'd definitely be wanting to take plenty of frames and hope that one of them come out sharp. And I'll just show you for reference. Here's an image that I took at 1/2 second, and you can see that is not a bad result, but it's definitely not 100% sharp in my opinion. It's not as sharp as the faster shutter speeds by any means. And finally, I'll just show you this one taken here at 1 second. So this was a 1 second exposure at 50mm on this heavy lens. And I was probably getting a bit tired by this point, but it's not sharp, but it's not far off it. So that isn't a bad result at all, considering the lens weight and the focal length. So I've done all the testing, I've shown you all the results, but what does this actually mean put into practice? So if I'm outdoors shooting, and we assume I'm shooting static subjects and there's no motion such as wind, movement in the trees or whatever, this is what I feel I've learned. So I hope you found this video useful. I know that this test has certainly been very useful for myself, and when I'm back outdoors shooting again, I really feel I've got a bit more knowledge now about the IBIS and the Fuji X-T4 and how it will work for me. So if you've enjoyed this video and would like to see some more, and you're not already subscribed to my channel, please consider subscribing. But for now, thanks as always for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in my next one.